He thought humiliating her in front of an entire bank lobby would make his morning easier. But the man who would walk through those glass doors minutes later was about to turn that small moment into a lesson no one in the room would ever forget. The marble floors of Atlantic Crown Bank reflected the soft glow of late morning sunlight pouring through the towering windows that stretched nearly 20 feet high. Quiet conversations drifted between polished counters while the faint clicking of expensive shoes echoed across the lobby. Men in tailored suits checked their watches. Women carrying designer handbags spoke in low voices, and every movement in the room carried the subtle rhythm of wealth and quiet authority. Into that carefully curated world stepped Emily Carter. She didn't look like the typical client who conducted business in a place like this. Her light gray cardigan hung loosely over a simple white blouse, and her comfortable jeans showed faint signs of wear from everyday life. Her brown hair was tied back in a practical ponytail, and the only jewelry she wore was a thin gold wedding band that caught the sunlight for a brief second as she pushed open the heavy glass door. No one greeted her when she entered. A few heads turned briefly before quickly returning to their paperwork, their phones, or their conversations. Emily had seen that look before, the quick glance that quietly measured a person's worth in less than a second. She walked calmly across the polished floor, her sneakers making almost no sound compared to the sharp clicks of polished leather shoes around her. Emily Carter had long ago learned not to take those looks personally. Appearances had fooled people her entire life, and she had never been interested in correcting them. She approached the customer service counter, holding a slim folder carefully in both hands. Inside the folder was a single check that represented months of fundraising work for a charity program she had spent years building. To her, the deposit was simply another step in helping a new group of students receive scholarships the following fall. But to the people inside Atlantic Crown Bank, it would soon become something very different. Behind the counter stood Rebecca Collins, the branch manager, a woman whose perfectly styled blonde hair and crisp navy blazer projected the polished authority expected from someone overseeing one of the most prestigious banks in the city. Rebecca prided herself on reading people quickly. Years in banking had convinced her that financial success carried a certain look, a certain posture, a certain level of refinement that could usually be recognized within seconds. When her eyes landed on Emily, standing quietly in front of the desk with that simple folder, Rebecca felt that familiar instinctive judgment settle into place. She offered a professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning," Emily said politely, her voice calm and steady. "I'd like to make a deposit and open a new account for a foundation." Rebecca's gaze drifted briefly to Emily's clothes before returning to her face. It was a subtle look, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Around them, a few nearby customers slowed their conversations, sensing the beginning of an interaction that might be more interesting than the routine financial transactions of the morning. Rebecca folded her hands neatly on the counter and tilted her head slightly. "Are you sure you're in the right bank, ma'am?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Emily blinked once, surprised but not offended. She had heard versions of that question before. Instead of responding immediately, she opened the folder and gently placed the check on the polished surface between them. The number printed across the top was large enough that Rebecca's expression shifted almost instantly. For a brief moment, the room seemed to grow quieter. And just across the lobby, near the tall windows overlooking the busy city street, a tall man in a navy suit ended a phone call and slowly turned toward the front desk. Rebecca Collins did not immediately touch the check. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing as she read the amount printed across the crisp paper. $250,000. For a moment, she wondered if she had misread it. Clients who handled deposits that large usually arrived with financial advisors, assistants, or at the very least a sense of polished confidence that matched the environment of Atlantic Crown Bank. The woman standing in front of her looked calm, almost relaxed, as if this transaction were nothing more than buying groceries on a quiet afternoon. Rebecca straightened slowly, her fingers resting on the counter, but still not reaching for the check. Around them, the subtle hum of the lobby continued, but several customers had begun to glance toward the desk, curiosity slowly replacing routine boredom. "That is a significant deposit," Rebecca said, her voice measured but noticeably cooler than before. "May I ask where these funds originated?" Emily did not seem offended by the question. She simply nodded and opened the folder again, sliding several neatly organized documents across the counter beside the check. The deposit is for the Carter Educational Foundation, she explained calmly. We just completed our annual fundraising gala last week, and the funds will support scholarships for students entering college next fall. Rebecca glanced briefly at the paperwork, but did not pick it up. Instead, her eyes drifted again to Emily's clothing, to the faded denim, the simple cardigan, the practical shoes that did not belong in a bank where clients often arrived wearing watches that cost more than an average car. Years of working in high-end banking had trained Rebecca to trust her instincts, and those instincts were telling her something did not add up. Our institution typically handles transactions of this size through private banking services, Rebecca replied slowly. Most clients schedule appointments for deposits of this magnitude. Emily remained polite. I understand. However, your office confirmed on the phone yesterday that I could come in this morning. I have all the documentation needed. Rebecca finally lifted the check, holding it carefully between two fingers as if inspecting it for flaws invisible to anyone else. The number still stared back at her in bold black ink. $250,000. A few nearby customers were now openly watching. In places like Atlantic Crown Bank, large amounts of money always attracted attention, and the contrast between the check and the woman presenting it made the situation even more intriguing. Rebecca placed the check back on the counter, but did not slide it toward the processing tray. Instead, she folded her arms lightly. Ms. Carter, was it? Emily nodded once. Rebecca offered a thin smile. Atlantic Crown Bank serves a very particular clientele. We take extra precautions to protect our clients from potential financial irregularities. The word irregularities lingered in the air long enough for several people nearby to exchange glances. Emily felt the shift in tone immediately. Her hands rested quietly on the folder while she kept her voice steady. All the documentation is there if you would like to review it. Rebecca tapped a manicured fingernail against the counter. That may be necessary. She looked again at the check and then back at Emily. Because checks of this size do raise certain questions when they are presented without prior verification. A man waiting behind Emily slowly stepped back, clearly interested in where the conversation might go. Rebecca's voice grew slightly louder, enough that it carried across the polished marble floor. You understand, of course, that legitimate financial activity usually follows very clear patterns. The implication was impossible to miss. Emily inhaled quietly, but remained composed. She had spent years running charity programs, negotiating with donors, and speaking with school administrators who sometimes doubted her plans before they understood them. This situation felt familiar in a different way. Rebecca leaned forward again, her tone no longer hiding the skepticism behind professional courtesy. I would hate to involve security if there has been some kind of misunderstanding. The words landed heavier than the marble beneath their feet. And at that exact moment, the tall man near the windows began walking across the lobby, his footsteps echoing softly with every step. Emily Carter did not move when Rebecca mentioned security. Instead, she rested her hands calmly on the folder in front of her and looked at the bank manager with the quiet patience of someone who had learned long ago that raising her voice rarely solved anything. Around them, the atmosphere in the lobby had shifted. Conversations had slowed, chairs had stopped moving, and more than one pair of curious eyes now drifted toward the front counter. Atlantic Crown Bank was used to quiet professionalism, not uncomfortable scenes unfolding in front of clients. Rebecca Collins seemed to notice the attention as well, but instead of lowering her voice, she lifted her chin slightly, her posture growing firmer as if the audience only strengthened her confidence. You must understand, she continued, her tone carefully controlled but clearly louder now. Financial institutions like ours operate under strict compliance regulations. When something unusual appears at the counter, we are required to examine it closely. The word unusual carried an edge that did not go unnoticed. Emily nodded slowly, acknowledging the explanation without challenging it. Of course, she replied gently. You are welcome to review everything. The foundation has operated for 5 years, and all of our financial records are public. Rebecca glanced down at the documents, but still did not pick them up. Instead, she tapped her fingers lightly against the polished marble surface of the desk. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet lobby. 5 years, she repeated thoughtfully, though her expression suggested doubt rather than interest. And you are the founder? Emily nodded again. Yes. Rebecca allowed a small smile to appear, one that did not quite hide the skepticism behind it. That is impressive, she said, though the compliment sounded more like polite disbelief. A man waiting several feet away adjusted his briefcase and leaned slightly closer, clearly listening now. Rebecca finally lifted one of the documents and glanced at it briefly before placing it back on the counter without reading further. You understand, she continued, that large charitable funds are often targets for fraud investigations. Emily remained composed. Yes, I am aware. Rebecca tilted her head again and looked Emily over once more from head to toe. Then you will also understand why a transaction like this might raise concerns when presented without advance verification. The implication hung in the air, heavier now than before. Emily felt the weight of the moment, but refused to let it show. She had stood in front of skeptical donors, school boards, and city committees before. Doubt was not unfamiliar territory. If there is a verification process, she said calmly, I am happy to complete it. Rebecca's fingers rested beside the check, but again she did not move it toward processing. Instead, she exhaled slowly and straightened her jacket, as if preparing to end the conversation. The appropriate process, she said carefully, would normally involve our private banking department reviewing the account holder before any funds of this size are accepted. She gestured lightly toward the check without touching it. At the moment, we do not have confirmation that these funds belong in our system. A few people in the lobby exchanged quiet glances. Emily could feel their attention even without turning around. The room had grown noticeably still. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to sound official, but still loud enough for those nearby to hear. Until that verification happens, I cannot proceed with this transaction. Emily remained silent for a moment. Then she gently closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. If that is your policy, she said softly, then perhaps I should speak with someone from private banking. Rebecca gave a thin smile. That department typically schedules meetings weeks in advance. She paused just long enough for the meaning to settle. Which is why I am suggesting that you return another day once proper arrangements have been made. Emily looked at the check again, then back at Rebecca. She was about to respond when a calm voice spoke from just behind her. Actually, the voice said evenly, I believe today will work perfectly fine. Several heads turned at once as the tall man in the navy suit stepped beside Emily, his presence suddenly changing the entire balance of the room. Rebecca Collins turned toward the voice with the composed confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation at her counter. The moment her eyes landed on the man standing beside Emily Carter, that confidence paused, just for a fraction of a second. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that fit with effortless precision. His dark hair was neatly styled, and the silver watch at his wrist reflected the soft light from the tall windows. But it was not the suit or the watch that changed the room. It was the quiet authority in the way he stood there, calm, observant, and entirely unhurried. Emily turned slightly and looked up at him, her expression softening immediately. Daniel, she said gently. The name seemed simple enough, but several employees nearby suddenly looked up from their desks. Rebecca's polite smile returned quickly, though the brief hesitation had not gone completely unnoticed by those watching. Sir, she said carefully, her voice regaining its professional tone, I am currently assisting this client. Daniel Carter nodded once, acknowledging the statement without stepping back. His eyes moved briefly from the check on the counter to the documents beside it, then to Emily's calm face. Yes, he replied evenly, I noticed. The lobby had grown quieter now. Even the faint tapping of keyboards had slowed as employees subtly followed the unfolding conversation. Rebecca folded her hands together again. As I was explaining, she continued, this transaction requires verification before it can proceed. Daniel glanced at the check again. $250,000, he said calmly. For the Carter Educational Foundation. Rebecca gave a short nod. Which is exactly why our compliance policies require additional confirmation. Daniel's gaze lifted slowly to meet hers. His voice remained calm. But something in the room shifted the moment he spoke again. And the verification you need, he said, is what exactly? Rebecca straightened slightly, now aware that more eyes in the lobby were watching than before. We simply need confirmation that the funds are legitimate and that the account holder meets our institution's requirements. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. as though considering the explanation. Requirements, he repeated quietly. His eyes moved briefly across the lobby, taking in the silent audience that had gathered without anyone realizing it. Several customers now stood nearby, pretending to review paperwork while clearly listening to every word. Daniel's attention returned to Rebecca. "My wife brought full documentation," he said calmly, gesturing toward the folder on the counter. Rebecca glanced at Emily again, her posture tightening slightly. "Yes, but documentation alone does not always resolve potential concerns." Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he gently placed one hand on the counter beside the check, his fingers resting casually against the polished marble. The movement was calm, almost relaxed, yet the quiet authority behind it seemed to ripple through the room. "Rebecca Collins," he said after a moment, reading the nameplate on her desk. Rebecca blinked once, surprised that he had noticed. "Yes." Daniel gave a small nod. "You mentioned security earlier." Rebecca's expression shifted slightly. "That was simply a precaution if necessary." Daniel looked at Emily again, then back at Rebecca. "My wife came here to deposit funds for a scholarship program that helps students attend college." His voice was steady, but now several employees had completely stopped working. "She also called ahead yesterday to confirm the process." Rebecca opened her mouth slightly, as if preparing to repeat her earlier explanation. But Daniel continued before she could speak. "So before we go any further," he said calmly, "perhaps it would help if we clarified something first." The room felt completely still now. Daniel straightened slightly and looked directly at Rebecca. "You said this bank serves a very particular clientele." Rebecca hesitated for the first time since the conversation began. Daniel's voice remained even as he spoke again. "Could you explain exactly what kind of clientele that is?" Rebecca Collins held Daniel Carter's gaze for a moment longer than she intended. The question sounded simple, but the way he asked it carried a quiet pressure that slowly spread through the lobby. For the first time since Emily had stepped up to the counter, Rebecca did not answer immediately. She straightened the sleeve of her blazer and allowed a polite smile to return, though it looked slightly less certain now. "Atlantic Crown Bank serves clients who maintain a strong financial relationship with our institution," she said carefully. "Our policies are designed to protect both the bank and our customers." Daniel nodded slowly, as if considering every word. "That sounds reasonable," he replied calmly. "But I am still not sure what that has to do with my wife depositing funds for a scholarship foundation." Emily stood quietly beside him, her hands resting lightly on the folder. She had not interrupted once, and the calm in her expression contrasted sharply with the growing tension that had settled over the room. Rebecca glanced briefly at the surrounding lobby. Several customers had stopped pretending to review documents and were now openly watching. One young teller had even paused with a stack of paperwork halfway through organizing it. Rebecca returned her attention to Daniel. "As I mentioned earlier, transactions of this size typically require prior arrangements through our private banking department." Daniel looked down at the check again and then back up at Rebecca. "And if those arrangements were not made in advance?" Rebecca hesitated for just a moment. "Then we ask clients to return once proper verification can be completed." Daniel folded his hands loosely on the counter. His posture remained relaxed, but there was something deliberate in the way he spoke next. "Rebecca," he said evenly, "you suggested earlier that the funds might raise concerns." Rebecca shifted slightly. "I simply said that unusual financial activity requires confirmation." Daniel nodded again. "Unusual?" He allowed the word to sit in the air for a moment. "Do you consider a charitable foundation depositing $250,000 unusual?" Rebecca opened her mouth as if to respond, but stopped herself. Daniel continued before the silence grew awkward. "The Carter Educational Foundation has funded scholarships for more than 300 students over the last 5 years." His voice remained calm, but now several people in the lobby exchanged surprised glances. Many of those students were the first in their families to attend college. Emily glanced at him quietly, but said nothing. Rebecca blinked once, clearly caught off guard by the information. "That is very admirable," she replied quickly, though her tone sounded slightly less confident than before. Daniel leaned back, just slightly, still resting one hand against the counter. "It is important work," he said, "which is why my wife handles these deposits personally." Rebecca looked down at the folder again. The documents were neatly organized, each page clearly labeled. For the first time since the conversation began, She reached forward and picked up the paperwork. Her eyes scanned the top page quickly. A few seconds passed. Then her expression shifted. It was subtle, but noticeable to anyone paying attention. Daniel watched quietly. Rebecca turned to the next page. Then another. The room seemed even quieter now than before. Finally, Rebecca looked back up. Carter Educational Foundation, she repeated slowly. Daniel nodded. Yes. Rebecca's eyes moved from Daniel to Emily and back again, something dawning behind her professional composure. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Is something wrong? Rebecca quickly placed the documents back on the counter, though her posture had clearly changed. No, she said quickly. Not at all. Daniel studied her expression calmly. Then he asked one more question, his voice steady but unmistakably direct. Rebecca, he said, before we continue, there is something you should probably know. Rebecca Collins felt the shift in the room before Daniel Carter even finished his sentence. The quiet confidence in his voice carried a weight that no longer felt like an ordinary conversation between a bank manager and a customer. Several employees nearby had completely stopped working now, their attention subtly fixed on the front counter. Daniel remained calm, his hand still resting lightly against the polished marble surface. Before we continue, he said evenly, there is something you should probably know. Rebecca forced a polite expression back onto her face, though the small hesitation in her posture was becoming more noticeable. And what would that be? She asked. Daniel glanced briefly at Emily, his expression softening for a moment before returning to Rebecca. The Carter Educational Foundation, he said, moves most of its financial operations through Morgan Capital Partners. Rebecca blinked once, the name immediately registering in her mind. Morgan Capital Partners was not a small regional firm. It was one of the largest investment groups in the country, responsible for managing billions of dollars in assets across multiple financial sectors. Rebecca had seen the name on financial reports more than once. Daniel continued calmly. Over the past 4 years, Morgan Capital has handled the foundation's investment, portfolio, scholarship distributions, and long-term endowment planning. Rebecca's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. I see, she said carefully. Daniel nodded once. Which means the funds you are looking at right now have already passed through several layers of financial verification. Emily remained quietly beside him, her hands still resting on the folder as though the growing tension in the room had nothing to do with her at all. Rebecca looked down again at the documents she had just placed back on the counter. This time she picked them up more carefully, scanning the first page with greater attention. The Carter Educational Foundation. Official registration documents. Financial certification forms. Donation records from multiple institutions. Every page was clearly organized and professionally prepared. Daniel watched without interrupting. Rebecca turned another page, and then another. Her breathing slowed slightly as she reached the final document, one that listed the managing financial partner responsible for the foundation's investment accounts. The name printed clearly near the bottom of the page. Morgan Capital Partners. Rebecca looked up again, her expression noticeably different now. Daniel's calm gaze met hers. Is there still a concern about verification? He asked quietly. Rebecca quickly placed the documents back on the counter, her earlier certainty now replaced with something far more cautious. No, she said quickly. That will not be necessary. Daniel nodded once, though he did not remove his hand from the counter. Good. Rebecca straightened her posture again, attempting to restore the professional tone she had carried earlier. In that case, we can certainly process the deposit. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Before we do that, he said, there is one more detail that may help clarify the situation. Rebecca waited, her attention completely fixed on him now. Daniel finally stepped slightly closer to the counter, his voice still calm, but carrying unmistakable authority. You see, he said, Morgan Capital Partners is not just the foundation's financial manager. The room had grown completely silent. Daniel allowed the moment to settle before finishing his sentence. It also happens to be the company I run. Several people in the lobby exchanged startled glances. Rebecca stared at him for a brief second, the realization arriving faster than she could hide it. Daniel Carter. The name suddenly aligned with the recognition she had felt earlier but could not quite place. The chief executive officer of Morgan Capital Partners was standing directly in front of her, beside the woman she had just suggested might require security escort. Daniel watched her expression change without raising his voice or his posture. "And the woman you were questioning a few minutes ago," he added calmly, "is my wife." The marble lobby fell into a silence so complete that even the faint sound of traffic outside the tall windows seemed louder than before. For a moment, Rebecca Collins simply stared at Daniel Carter, as if the entire meaning of the last 30 seconds had not yet fully reached her. The name echoed in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. Daniel Carter, Chief Executive Officer of Morgan Capital Partners. A man whose interviews appeared regularly on national financial networks, whose company managed billions of dollars in investment assets, and whose financial influence quietly shaped decisions across the banking industry. The silence inside Atlantic Crown Bank grew so complete that even the faint hum of the air conditioning system seemed unusually loud. Rebecca felt the attention of the entire lobby settle on her shoulders. Her confident posture from earlier in the morning had disappeared, replaced by a sudden stiffness that she could not quite control. She cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Carter," she said quickly, her tone now noticeably different from before. "I was not aware that you were involved in this transaction." Daniel Carter did not raise his voice, nor did he show any sign of anger. He simply stood beside Emily with the same calm presence he had carried since walking across the lobby. "That is understandable," he replied evenly. "My wife handles most of the foundation's daily work herself." Emily offered a small, polite smile, though she said nothing. Rebecca looked briefly at Emily, then back at Daniel, the realization still settling in layers. Only minutes earlier, she had suggested that the woman beside him might need security escort from the building. Now the entire situation felt painfully different. Rebecca reached quickly for the check on the counter, her hands moving with renewed urgency. "Of course we can process this deposit immediately," she said. "There will be no delay." Daniel did not move. His gaze drifted slowly across the lobby, noticing the employees who had quietly gathered behind their desks and the customers pretending to review paperwork while listening closely. When he looked back at Rebecca, his voice remained calm but carried quiet. "Wait, you seemed very certain earlier that this transaction required additional verification." Rebecca forced a tight smile. "That was simply part of our compliance procedures." Daniel nodded slightly. "And the concern about security?" Rebecca's expression tightened further. "A precaution only," she said quickly. "Nothing more." Emily gently placed her hand on the folder again, as if reminding herself why she had come to the bank in the first place. She looked at Daniel quietly. "Daniel, it is all right," she said softly. "We just need the deposit processed." Daniel turned toward her, and his expression softened again. "Of course." He looked back at Rebecca. "My wife came here this morning to deposit funds that will support dozens of students entering college next year." Rebecca nodded rapidly. "Yes, of course." Daniel's tone remained steady. "Students whose families often earn less in a year than the value of that check." Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. The earlier judgment she had shown now felt painfully visible in front of the entire room. Daniel continued quietly. "Emily chooses to visit places like this herself because she believes the people receiving those scholarships deserve to know someone personally cares about their future." Emily shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable being the focus of the conversation. Rebecca quickly moved the check toward the processing tray. "We will begin the transaction immediately," she said. Daniel watched the movement, but did not yet step away from the counter. The lobby remained completely silent, as if everyone present understood that something far more important than a simple financial deposit had just unfolded in front of them. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Rebecca," he said gently, "there is one more thing I would like you to understand before we finish here." Rebecca Collins froze slightly when Daniel Carter said those words. The quiet firmness in his tone carried none of the anger she might have expected, yet it somehow felt heavier than if he had raised his voice. The entire lobby seemed to lean into the moment. No one spoke. Even the customers who had been pretending not to watch had now stopped pretending altogether. Daniel remained composed, his posture relaxed, his hand still resting lightly against the marble counter, as if the situation required no dramatic gesture at all. Emily Carter stood beside him with the same quiet patience she had carried from the moment she first stepped through the glass doors of the bank. Daniel looked at Rebecca calmly. "You see," he continued, "this situation is not really about the deposit." Rebecca nodded quickly, though she clearly did not know what else to say. Her earlier confidence had dissolved into careful silence. Daniel's voice remained steady. My wife spends most of her time working with students who have never walked into a building like this. He gestured gently toward the polished lobby around them. Students who often believe places like this are not meant for people like them. Several people in the room shifted slightly as they listened. Daniel continued. Many of them come from families where no one has ever had a bank account, let alone applied for college. Emily lowered her eyes briefly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but allowing him to continue. Daniel looked back at Rebecca. The reason Emily handles these deposits personally is because she believes that helping someone change their future should never feel like a distant transaction. Rebecca swallowed quietly. Daniel's calm words made the earlier conversation feel even more uncomfortable than before. She meets the students. She reads their applications. She listens to their stories. Daniel paused for a moment before speaking again. And when the scholarship funds are deposited, she likes to know that the process is handled with the same respect those students deserve. Rebecca looked down at the check in front of her, her expression now far removed from the confident skepticism she had shown earlier. Daniel continued gently. When Emily walked into this bank today, she came as someone who wanted to help young people achieve something their families had never experienced before. The silence in the lobby felt deeper now, almost reflective. Daniel's gaze remained calm. But before you even looked at the documents she brought, you had already decided what kind of client she must be. Rebecca's face flushed slightly. She opened her mouth as if to apologize, but Daniel raised his hand gently, not to stop her harshly, but simply to finish what he was saying. This is not about embarrassment, he said calmly. Everyone makes quick judgments sometimes. Rebecca nodded quickly, though the tension in her shoulders remained visible. Daniel gestured lightly toward the check again. $250,000 will help dozens of students start college next year. His voice softened slightly. For many of them, it will be the first time anyone in their family has ever stepped onto a university campus. Emily looked at him quietly, a faint smile appearing despite the uncomfortable scene that had unfolded. Daniel then looked back at Rebecca one final time. Money moves through banks every day, he said calmly. But the way people are treated while they are standing at the counter is what they remember. Rebecca slowly lowered her gaze again, understanding the meaning behind his words more clearly than any lecture could have delivered. Daniel stepped back slightly from the counter, allowing the room to breathe again. The marble lobby remained silent for another long moment, as if everyone present understood that something far more valuable than a financial transaction had just taken place in that quiet space. Rebecca Collins stood very still behind the counter as Daniel Carter's words settled over the quiet lobby. For several seconds, she said nothing. The confident bank manager who had been certain of her authority only minutes earlier now seemed smaller beneath the soft lights reflecting off the marble floor. Finally, she drew a slow breath and lifted her eyes again. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, her voice no longer sharp but measured and sincere. "You are right." The words came quietly, yet everyone close enough to hear understood how difficult they were for her to say. She looked briefly at Emily Carter before continuing. "Mrs. Carter, I owe you an apology." Emily did not respond immediately. She simply watched Rebecca with the same calm patience she had carried throughout the entire encounter. Rebecca continued, her voice steady but noticeably softer. "When you walked into this bank, I judged you before I took the time to understand who you were or what you were here to do." The admission hung in the air like a small weight finally being set down. Several employees behind the desks exchanged glances, clearly aware that they had witnessed something unusual. Rebecca straightened slightly, though the firmness in her posture now carried humility rather than authority. "That was not the standard of respect we expect to show our clients." Emily offered a small, gentle smile. "Thank you for saying that," she replied quietly. Her voice carried no anger, only calm sincerity. Rebecca nodded once, relieved but still visibly thoughtful. She carefully lifted the check again and placed it into the processing tray. "The deposit will be completed immediately," she said. Daniel Carter watched the exchange silently for a moment. The tension that had filled the lobby earlier had softened into something quieter, almost reflective. Finally, he nodded once in acknowledgement. "That is all we came here for," he said calmly. Rebecca began entering the transaction into the system, while one of the nearby tellers stepped forward to assist. The usual sounds of the bank slowly returned as keyboards clicked and printers hummed softly. Yet the room still carried a subtle awareness of what had just happened. Emily closed the folder and rested her hands lightly against the counter. "The scholarship announcements go out in 3 weeks," she said softly to Daniel. "Some of those students have already written letters about what college will mean for their families." Daniel smiled faintly. "Then this deposit is going to change a lot of lives." Rebecca looked up from the computer screen briefly. "It already has," she said quietly. The transaction receipt printed a moment later, sliding from the machine with a soft mechanical sound. Rebecca handed it across the counter with careful respect. Emily accepted it with a small nod. Daniel glanced around the lobby once more before gently placing his hand on Emily's shoulder. "Are we ready?" he asked. Emily nodded. Together they turned toward the glass doors. As they walked across the marble floor, the room remained strangely quiet, as if everyone present had paused to reflect on what they had just witnessed. Near the entrance, Daniel slowed for a moment and looked back toward the counter. Rebecca Collins met his gaze across the room. Daniel gave a small, respectful nod before turning back toward the sunlight outside. The glass doors closed quietly behind them, leaving the lobby of Atlantic Crown Bank just a little different than it had been that morning. Because sometimes the most valuable lesson a place of business can learn is that true wealth is not measured by the numbers written on a check, but by the respect shown to the person holding it.